Anyway, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. I thought, from my perspective, I would talk about what attracted me first to Lower Manhattan and the financial district particularly, and some of the sort of a macroeconomic point of view down to the actual specific micro decisions that are made, which we can talk about this building and why it stayed commercial, and the various analyses we did to determine what use this would be. So in roughly, this building was purchased in March of '98, and at that point it looked like a very expensive purchase. It was about $135 a square foot. By today's standards, it would be a bargain, I would think. But one of the things when we got down here was to take a look at really what I was looking at, where does one invest? I'm in the real estate business, so I was going to continue to invest in real estate, but I wanted to look at really put a business plan together and make a decision and focus on one thing and then carry it through, and until the paradigm changed, continue and grow from that perspective, which was a little bit unique. My grandfather, who was a major real estate investor, I know didn't sit and put together a business plan per se. I'm sure he had the intuitive idea, but not necessarily directly on paper. And when one does have to put thoughts on paper, from a blank piece of paper, it is glaring because you have to actually write something and think about it. So I wrote things that were important for me as an investor in real estate. I wanted to be in a large environment, right, where there was a secondary marketplace. So if the market went down, there would still be a lot of activity. We purchased a building in June of 1986 in Southern California in Long Beach. The rents today are no different than they were in 1986 when we bought the building, only the expenses have certainly risen. And part of that is because the size of that community isn't large enough in office space to keep an active market going. The tenants are merely stolen from one building to another building, but there's no real growth in there. So that would be something I didn't want to replicate in that. So I took a look at all these kind of things. So what did Lower Manhattan look like when I started looking? It was a third, at that time, largest concentration of office space in the United States. Midtown was first, Chicago was second, and Lower Manhattan was third. Today, some say that Washington, D.C. has surpassed that. But it's a big concentration, lots of activity, and a good secondary marketplace. So if the market went bad, you still have activity in tenants. So if you can perform as well as or better than the market, you have a chance to continue to lease. Second thing was there was a growing residential population. That was very important because one of the things that was commented about downtown is that at 5 o'clock, nobody's here anymore. And that wasn't stimulating to the people that were working here. So with a growing residential population would come other things and much more of a 24-hour city. So that was something that was important. Interesting that on a per capita basis, okay, per zip code, Lower Manhattan here has the highest education rate per capita per zip code of anywhere in the United States, okay, both by day and by night. And there were two different populations, clearly. Also, it had the highest income per capita by day, which made sense. Wall Street was down here per zip code. And at the time, it had the highest income per capita per zip code by night. It's the first time in about 150 years that both by day and night, it was in the same location in the United States for income generation. Today, I think we're about third. Mountain View, California is number one. I think in the Upper East Side now, with all the zip code changes, one of those zip codes up there is the highest. But clearly, the wealth and education was sitting here. Tourism, Broad and Wall Street, I think, has the second highest tourist population in Manhattan behind Times Square. Okay? Retail, it had the highest income production for retail per square foot for sales anywhere in the world, right? Was the World Trade Center. More dollars per square foot were generated there than anywhere else on earth. Hotel, one of the highest occupancies was in Lower Manhattan, and on and on and on. And yet, when you came here, there was it was number one in every category, and everybody's perception was that, this was barren and it had problems and it didn't have any of those kind of statistics. So what I saw was there was a big arbitrage. There was reality and the perception. And usually, as a developer, you're trying to change the perception, not necessarily with reality, but with marketing and ideas, and convince people that a new paradigm is really existing, and then it hopefully fulfills itself. Here it was the opposite. This had everything already, and yet the perception was it didn't. Number one big issue here, that if you asked every commercial broker, was the biggest problem in Lower Manhattan was transportation, okay? Yet, there's more railroad track here per square foot than anywhere else on Earth. So if you have more transportation, why was it considered terrible? And yet you could get everywhere from Lower Manhattan. You get anywhere on the east side, the west side, New Jersey, Brooklyn, all over. And it's the only point that you can do that, really. And yet everybody said it was terrible. Well, what they weren't looking at really was the difference between a delivery system, right, new stations, Grand Central stations, and transportation. Transportation was here. Our delivery system wasn't so good. So after 9/11, what happened? All of the delivery systems, if you will, were recreated. So you have a brand new Staten Island ferry terminal. Beautiful, done. You have a Battery Park ferry terminal under construction. You have the PATH station under construction, and you have the Fulton Street transit station under construction. Each one of those roughly was about the largest individual project, transportation hub project in the U.S. All three of them, with the fourth being the Staten Island ferry, all were in Manhattan. Three of them were connected together or will be connected together. And that's extraordinary. You'll have a one-seat ride to Newark Airport. Eventually, hopefully, have a one-seat ride to Kennedy. All here. So what we did is we took the greatest transportation system, and now we put the greatest delivery system. So for me, if transportation, we live on an island, right? So one of the biggest issues is how do you get people on and off an island and get them around the island safely, quickly, efficiently, and hopefully comfortably. So if a commodity, and I believe that's one of the most important things for locations in New York, is transportation hubs. Penn Station, phenomenal. Grand Central Station. It didn't come about because people liked the area necessarily. It came about because it was very convenient to all the transportation. So if a commodity of transportation is, in my opinion, very critical to living on an island, and this had more of it than anywhere else, I think that would be a good place to invest. So it was number one in all these categories, and that was what started to attract me. And then after what happened at 9/11, I went and redoubled all my efforts for acquisition because there was a huge problem. Values decreased, but all of the goodness was still here. The residential population was still increasing, and then we had an opportunity to go recreate all of the transportation delivery systems and everything else. Some $16 billion of public money was pouring into Lower Manhattan. Every pipe south of Chambers Street, correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, but was replaced after 9/11. Every water main pipe, every water pipe, every telecommunications pipe in Con Edison. So you have a brand new infrastructure underground. You've got brand new transportation hubs coming around. You've got a rising residential population. You have more schools being built here than any other district, and it goes on and on and on. Then, what do you have? You're going to have the World Trade Center Memorial, where already we had a huge tourist population, right? So you now put that there. The amount of tourists that are going to come into that is going to be extraordinary. And we have a little tiny island of Hawaii where Pearl Harbor is that gets millions and millions of visitors because it's one of the few places that we were attacked by foreigners in this country. Now you have one of the most convenient places, Manhattan, and one of the most sought-after places to visit with a memorial there. So now you're going to have a massive tourist population. And it just keeps getting better, and people kept not knowing that. And I would really liken it to Times Square. Everybody, in the 1980s, early 1980s, said Times Square was a terrible place to be. It was, dirty, and it was crime-ridden, etc. Then they went and built all these buildings, and everybody said it's a terrible area, it's crime-ridden, etc. Then they built the residential population, started moving in. Everybody said the same thing. Not until Disney came in with Lion King, and everybody brought their children, all the local people brought and looked in the day and said they didn't even know where they were. You know, that's, I think, what's going to happen here. If you asked, in my opinion, the average New Yorker, what's going on with the World Trade Center, they would just say, oh, they're fighting, they don't know. But, you know, Freedom Tower's on the 36th floor. The 14th floor is now rising on Tower 4. All of it's under construction. There are trees actually planted in the memorial. And most of us in New York don't know that. All the tourists know it because they come to New York and they assume they don't know much, so they learn and they see it. We know New York, so we don't need to go learn and see it. And that's really the arbitrage that I saw. So obviously, I'm a big fan of this area, but when you have all these statistics in number one, it tells me at least that I think there's a good opportunity to invest. So this was the first building we did. So, and I'll just give you through the thought process from a micro economic point of view. So we bought the building, and it was occupied by the Bank of New York. They stayed in occupancy in our agreement for 11, 12 months after we bought the building. So we had that flow of income. Then we had to figure out what we were going to do with the building because they were leaving. So in the backdrop was going on was everybody was converting to residential. And by the way, today we've had some 54 buildings representing about 16.5 million square feet converted from residential, commercial to residential, on top of which we lost 13 million square feet in 9/11. So New York, Lower Manhattan here lost plus or minus almost 26% of all of its office space, which was all occupied. It wasn't empty. So that, I don't know another city that could withstand losing 26% of its office space. You know, so thankfully we're building back the World Trade Center because you can't grow a city if you're shrinking it. I mean, it's sort of obvious. And it's critical that we put back office space to bring back population back here. But in 98, all that wasn't happening in terms of 9/11, but there was office space conversion. So what we were looking at here is take this building and convert it into residential. And take a look at it also for hotels and look at it for office space. So what was the thought process? The office market, it was about $22, $23 a square foot at the time. We have 324,000 square feet here. My worry was we'd have to, gut the building, which we were going to do, renovate it, and then it would take a long time to lease up because the floor plates here are relatively small. The base is about 13,500 feet, and then it shrinks up to, graduates up to, 3,500 feet. So there's not going to be one tenant that's going to take up a lot of space, which meant that you're going to have to do a lot of leases. And if the market had a hiccup in the process and you were in the leasing campaign and it took years to get filled up, one could have a big financial problem. So we kept that in the back of our minds, and we ran the numbers, and it produced a certain income. Then we ran the numbers for residential. Now, in the residential market, what was this building? This building had 192,000 square feet of actual rent-paying space. In the office, it had 324,000 square feet. Same building. The difference is, in commercial, one pays rent if, one can gain rent from a different measurement, which takes basically the gross of the building less some penetrations, vertical penetrations, and then you add back a loss factor to get back basically to the same gross square footage of a building. In a rental building for residential, you actually can only charge on the apartment itself, no corridors, no lobbies, no nothing. So we could only produce income of about 192,000 square feet. But at that time, we were looking at doing what they call shorter stays. You do a one-year lease, but then you're allowed to cancel it under certain conditions. So it's a short-term rental, if you will. That we saw gaining about $65 to $75 per square foot against the commercial, which was about $23, $22 per square foot. Still, you only had 192,000 square feet versus 324. They almost equalized. But we thought we could fill the building faster in residential. So we decided to go residential. Simultaneously, we were negotiating with Intercontinental Hotels and signed a contract with them to master lease this whole building and put a hotel here. And they had a wonderful plan with buyer Blinder Bell and spent a lot of money doing it. And it would produce roughly the same dollars as both either the residential or commercial. So we were torn of what to do, so we pursued residential and the hotel. And my feeling was that we had time to make a decision because one of those uses would, would just, bless you, would come up higher and would ultimately, tell us what to do. So we that's not me, is it? Good. We ended up demolishing the building, all the interiors of the building, but we left all of the stairways, left all the elevators, which were due to come out to convert to residential. But I was a little nervous about making that final decision, so we did that last. It took almost 11 months to demolish the interior of the building at the time, because everything back then was built with either cinder block or, really thick stone. So it took time to demolish. We didn't have they didn't have sheetrock back then. So the bank stayed in occupancy for 12 months. We then picked up the building in March or April of '99 and went to do the interior demolition, which took us 11 months. We developed all our plans. We were ready to go start construction on the apartments themselves. And I started putting out teaser ads to the residential community. We thought really nice ads, creative, and the more residential ads we put out, the more commercial brokers called. The more residential ads we put out, even more commercial brokers called. And after a while, somebody throws a rock at your head, you feel a lump, you start thinking. So we reevaluated. We worked with Cushman & Wakefield at the time, and I asked them to do a study, a very specific study. And this is what I think, for my career in the past, really made a big change. And that study was, take a look at all commercial buildings in New York, Lower Manhattan, with floor plates under 15,000 square feet and in a certain area, and what is the vacancy rate there versus the larger vacancy that was looming out in the market at the time. And what we found was it was very low, because if you look at New York City, the average lease, we have 400 million square feet in New York, plus or minus, okay? Take downtown San Francisco, take downtown Los Angeles, take downtown Philadelphia, take downtown Washington, D.C., and take downtown Chicago, and one other city. There's one more, whatever. But the six largest, about downtown Boston. Take the six largest cities in the United States, they do not add up to the square footage Manhattan has. I mean, we're a very large city. The average lease in this city is about 3,800 square feet, right? So what are we? We are a very large office user of very small businesses. And that is what drives New York. It's not the huge, giant tenants, although they're extremely important, but it's the thick part of the market, the diamond. If it's a diamond, you want that fat part of the market. It's smaller tenants. And guess what? This building has smaller floor plates. It would attract smaller tenants. So when we started really looking at the market, and specifically the micro market of Wall Street, we found that all the vacancy typically was in the larger buildings and not the smaller buildings. We also found that all the older buildings that were Class D or C buildings, which could have been converted to a B plus building, instead were converted to residential. So there were no buildings that offered tenants A kind of services in a B plus building in this part of the area, because anytime they would be renovated, they were taken out of the marketplace and converted to residential, like we were going to do. So we quickly said, no, we're not doing residential. We threw out all the plans. We didn't have to do much because the building was already a building itself. So there were 17 elevators in the building. We did take out a lot of them because some of the staff in the Bank of New York or the chairman had his own elevator every time he wanted to go somewhere. We didn't need to do that. So we went and did a whole major renovation of the building. I mean, we put 667 new windows. We everything top to bottom. It's as sophisticated as any new building was at the time, housed in a landmark building. And it was wonderful. We worked with Landmarks at the time. When we bought the building, we approached Landmarks and told them that we'd be willing to landmark the building because we knew they wanted to. And it was a wonderful success. And we found that we got all the good tenants in the marketplace. We got a little bit more money, but not that much. But we rented very quickly. And we stayed away, thankfully, from all the dot-com companies because I was very nervous about renting space twice. You know, you go rent it once, they go out of business, and you'd be stuck with the space. And they were offering us crazy numbers at the time, but it just didn't seem real. So we did 2 deals with 2 dot-com companies, and we went 0 for 2. And thankfully, they were small, and the rest we did sort of what they used to call the old economy tenants, which is the real economy of what we are. And we filled the building up with wonderful tenants. From there, we found that it made a lot of sense to duplicate it. So we did it at 44 Wall, then 5 Hanover Square. We did 80 Broad, 90 Broad, and what we did is we took all these older buildings that were architecturally very distinctive and wonderful, and renovated them, we think, very, sensitively, bringing back the luster of the buildings, but putting in all great services. So for instance, like in this building, while it has every sophistication in the world, the original room on the 4th floor, is still up there. And that was the boardroom that came from the first building. Then they took it apart, put it in the second building, and then when the Bank of New York built this building, they took the same elements and put it back in there. And it's wonderful. And at the same time, you still have a very sophisticated building. So for us, it worked out very, very well. And the process of going through finally did show its head. So the net is that if you really do take a look at the demographics of Lower Manhattan here, and you actually pay attention to them and really look as if you were a foreigner, which I did. I said, I don't know anything here, let me start fresh. It was very unique, and from that we were thankfully very successful with our projects, and it allowed us to sit here today in a nice museum, which is terrific. So anyway, thank you very much.